Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to be here. I'm going to give folks just another minute or so to join, and then we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. Again, thank you everyone so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. We really appreciate you joining us. We are going to get started in just a moment, but I'm going to give folks just another 30 seconds or so to jump on if they haven't done so already, and then we will jump right in. All right. So again, thank you everyone so much for taking the time this afternoon to be with us. We really appreciate you being here. A few housekeeping items. First, my name is Becky Timmons. I'm with Common Cause, and I'll be moderating this briefing for us this afternoon. This is being recorded. You have permission to record this as well, but know that we are recording it too. And as soon as it's done being processed, we will send it out to all of you so that you have this for your records in whatever use case you would like. We are going to hear from all of our panelists first, hear from them and what their organizations are doing for redistricting in Nebraska, and then we will take the time for Q&A at the end. Of course, as they are speaking, if you have questions, feel free to put a question, in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen or in the chat box. Or if you want to ask your question verbally, you can raise your hand as well, and we will get to those. But know that we will not be answering any questions until that designated Q&A at the end here. And I will try to answer or get them answered in the order that I see them come in. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and that is Danielle Conrad of ACLU Nebraska. Danielle.
Hi, thank you so much, Becky, and thank you to all of our partners who have joined us here today on this call and who have been working tirelessly for months and years together to prepare for this historic redistricting task that is before us. And warm welcome to all of our media friends and community members that are on today as well. My name is Danielle Conrad. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Nebraska. I use she, her pronouns. So I just wanted to kind of start with some overview, kind of table setting information about redistricting, and then we'll get further and further into the granular work before the Nebraska legislature this year. But it's important to remember that redistricting is about voting rights. It's about your political power. It's about our families and our communities. And we warmly invite all of our Nebraska neighbors to participate in this process and to not be turned off by the bureaucratic or political jargon that's sometimes surrounding redistricting. This is a key opportunity to get engaged. This is a key opportunity to let your voice be heard. This is a key opportunity to hold elected officials accountable, because voters should choose their politicians, not the other way around. That's how it works in a democracy. So what is this all about? Of course, we know every 10 years we get updated information from the US Census that we need to utilize at the state and local level to ensure our elections are fair, to ensure that we're honoring those core democratic values and principles, including one person, one vote. So state senators have gavelled in to start a special session on redistricting just today. There are a flurry of different maps and proposals flying around about what our congressional districts, our legislative districts, our state Supreme Court districts might look like over the next 10 years. And this week, Nebraska voters have a critical opportunity to let their voice be heard in public hearings across the state. It's really important as we head into this that we remember when it comes to redistricting, this isn't about incumbents, this isn't about candidates, this is about voters. We can recognize and give voice to how changing demographics can cause anxiety in our communities, but we can be liberated by what the law tells us about redistricting. And that means we have to get as close to one person, one vote as possible. We have to have this be a data-driven process, not a partisan-driven process. We have to have this process be fair in process and result. We have to honor our proud, unique Nebraska traditions to be nonpartisan. And we can't forget for 1 second that when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to redistricting, racial justice is also at stake. And it's critical that state senators and local officials don't work to diminish or dilute the political power of Black voters and voters of color. So those are the key hallmarks that sound redistricting really should take into account and will help to chart and guide our path together in this discussion and through the redistricting special session that is before us. And not only is this grounded in what federal law and state law tells us about some of the best practices for redistricting, but it's also mirrored in what Nebraska voters want. The ACLU conducted a poll on this topic in 2021, and just the numbers were off the charts. 70, 80, 90% of Nebraska voters wanted this to be a data-driven process that was transparent, that was participatory, that was nonpartisan, and that did not dilute the power of voters of color and Black voters. Nebraska legislators need to heed that clarion call to not only follow the law, but to follow the will of Nebraska voters and get this right. So with that, I'll turn it over to some of our other panelists and stay on hand to answer any questions if we can be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle, for that sort of context setting. I now want to turn it over to Carol Dennison, who is with the League of Women Voters Nebraska. Oh, Carol, I believe you are on mute.
Hi, sorry. I am Carol Dennison from the League of Women Voters of Nebraska and also the Fair Maps Committee. And the Fair Maps Committee was an initiative started at the US level that has gone all around the country to try to work for fair maps in all of these locations. So my cohort, Sherry St. Clair, and our team have been working on this, probably about 2 years now that we have been aware of this initiative. And one of the things we are most concerned about, of course, is the idea that in a state that has only a unicameral, we, the people, are the second house, and we deserve to be a full part of this process. I think we have worked very hard to say to the senators, we have written letters and we have engaged them in a number of phone calls and letters to say that we want them to open up this process. Particularly we're concerned about the speed of this whole transaction now because of the delay in the census reporting on numbers, so that all of this process has been hurried up so much. And we're concerned that there just isn't enough time for people to digest what's coming in through these maps now and to be able to analyze what they are and to give fair input about their neighborhoods. Yesterday, I did a presentation in Lincoln, and a woman there was saying, well, I see our neighborhood is going to be hooked up to a whole nother rural area in Waverly. How can they do that? We have never been separated like this. So people are concerned. They're wondering why and how can they get some kind of input. And I think that's very much where we are right now.
Thank you so much, Carol. I now want to turn it over to Preston Love Jr., who is with Black Votes Matter.
Thank you very much. And I surely, again, would say hello to my fellow panelists and to our friends, and I underline that, our friends in the media. Surely hope that you know that I am the founder and director of Black Votes Matter, which has become the central organization in North Omaha that is advocates for voter participation and voter rights in our community as well as throughout Nebraska. And the work that we do is primarily for, of, and by the people of North Omaha. Our activity, and let me also say that I thank the League and Ms. Conrad for setting the framework for comments that we all would make going forward. There's surely things that I could expand, but I think the framework has been set. The one thing that I bring to this discussion beside the work of Black Votes Matter is my 40+ years of working in voter participation all over the country, but in the last 15 years in my beloved hometown of Omaha and neighborhood of North Omaha. I bring a passion to fairness. And so as it relates to redistricting, we as Black Votes Matter have witnessed for sure 2 cycles of redistricting back in 10 years ago. I surely have some comments on that redistricting, but who cares anymore? Except for we learned the good, the bad, and the ugly from the experience that we had from the 2010 census and redistricting. I want to say, as a way of crystallizing my comments, that there is good in the process of redistricting. We surely can focus on the bad and the ugly. The good is that our population has shifted in its various ways, and it is good to take an independent, nonpartisan, and fair look at how that population change should be recalibrated to reflect a population and the lines of our state Senate and our congressional district to reflect those changes. That's a good part of redistricting, and we surely avow that. The bad part, quite frankly, is that if redistricting becomes a process for partisanship, unfairness, and is not independent, then it's really not a good process. The ugly, quite frankly, is egregious and intentional favoritism for candidates or a party, and it couldn't be called and is gerrymandering. I'm very concerned as a Black Votes Matter and North Omaha advocate and spokesman, quite frankly, that we keep within our community the integrity of our community. It is often said that we don't want to harm the Black community in redistricting. I would reframe that to say we don't want to harm a community that has its own culture, its own neighborhoods, its own rhythm, its own set of issues, and its own nature. And if it happens to be Black and African American, then oh, so be it. But it's more about the people, the community, and its cohesiveness and its context than it is about the color. But the color can be affected. So we are advocates for nothing that would tamper with the one person, one vote attempt of the good part of redistricting, and that we surely will fight for anything that looks and acts like suppression or restriction or overt favoritism. And so that's why we're at this table and we're at this panel. Appreciate the ability to answer any specific questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Preston. Next up, we have Gavin Geiss, who is with Common Cause Nebraska.
Thank you, Becky. Hello, I'm Gavin Geiss. I'm the executive director with Common Cause Nebraska. And redistricting is a topic I've been addressing, working on for the past 5 years. So I'm vaguely familiar with some of it and interested in all of it. I'll do my best not to reiterate actually the really great stuff that came before. Thank you to the panelists who joined us here today. Your expertise makes this far easier on the rest of us, so thank you. I would like to start by just commenting on the comments, the advocacy that these organizations on the call and many others have already made to this process earlier this year during the regular session. And then during the summer of this year, the organizations here and many others have been hammering home many of the just values and principles that the redistricting process should follow. And unfortunately, many of those principles and values have not been met by the legislature. And in so doing, we risk a process that doesn't involve the public. This summer, the group, these organizations represented here, as well, like I said, as well as many others, sent a letter to the redistricting committee with a set of principles, key tenets that we felt were vital to a transparent and accountable process. And unfortunately, like I said, many of those principles have been put aside. Our first principle was to keep communities together. That is, don't split up cities, don't split up counties. As we go into the maps and look at them, there are definitely issues at hand there that we've already seen. If we look at the second congressional district, we'll talk about that more, but the question of can we split up cities and counties while we draw district maps, that is a top priority in the redistricting process, to not split up communities that already exist. Unfortunately, some of the maps we've received from the committee already go against that. Second, we called for a nonpartisan process. That is, partisanship should be set aside, as it is in the legislature itself here in Nebraska. Partisanship should not play a role in the redistricting process. As we've seen over the last week, and the committee's introduction of multiple sets of maps representing the interests of Republicans on one hand and Democrats on the other, nonpartisanship has already proven to be a struggle for the committee and will likely continue to prove to be a struggle for the committee and the body as they go into deciding on a final set of maps. The fact that the committee could not release a single unified set of maps, could not agree on that, does not bode well for the overall discussion and the outcome of this, frankly, vital and most important political process of the year. Our third point was public access and input. We called for as much public access and public input in the process as we could. Thankfully, there will be a set of 3 public hearings, correct, this week in Grand Island, Lincoln, and Omaha. So there is the opportunity for public access, public input. And as others have said, we encourage every single Nebraskan who cares about this, who wants fair districts, who wants districts that represent them, to contact their legislators to take part in those. But there's far more the legislature could have done in terms of public access and input. There is no reason that the legislature couldn't have held hearings prior to the release of census data, prior to the drawing of district maps. In short, there's more public access and public input needed in this process. Nebraskans have been shortchanged. Maps were dropped in the past week, and now we have hearings. We worry there's not enough time for the average Nebraskan to review, to form an opinion, and to participate. So we encourage more public access, more public input as we go through this process, even if we've fallen short. Next, we called for transparency of process. Transparency of this process is as public access, public input, but actual transparency of the work the committee's doing, the data they're relying on, the maps they're being sent by organizations. That level of transparency would lift this entire process, would make us all more assured that it's being done fairly and that maps aren't being drawn and influenced by those outside of the process. Transparency is vital, and yet we have yet to see much transparency other than the maps. We would call for greater transparency, a greater access to the data that the committee is relying on. As said before, the census is our key that we call for, that we want the redistricting committee to rely on, the entire legislature, no outside data should be used. As to date, it seems the census has been followed. They're using only census data, but that is a vital consideration in this is, do we follow census data? Do we trust census data? All of us here trust in the process that the Census Bureau went through last year. We all believe the data is good and should be held to. We encourage the entire legislature to rely only on census data as they go through the process of debating these maps, and to not be led astray by partisan data, by partisan registration, or other data sources that will skew maps. Finally, we asked for the protection of historically oppressed groups. That is, as many of you will know, and as Preston I'm sure can speak more to, North Omaha, that community is one specifically we think of when we talk about, but there are others in Omaha and throughout the state that deserve the protection of their identity, of their population in the redistricting process. We should not, the legislature should not, ignore these communities of shared interest as they go about the redistricting process. And it's vital that they're maintained once final maps are decided upon, we'll say. The maps we have now are not, of course, final, but when final maps are drawn, it's vital that these communities that have historically been left out, been disadvantaged, been hurt by practices like gerrymandering for political wins, they should be preserved, they should be protected, and they should take precedence in the redistricting process. So having said all that, those were the principles we called for this summer. Some of them have been held to, others could be greatly improved on. Some have been, in our view, outright ignored. We think this should be the most publicly involved process that the legislature does. And there is a lot of ground to be made up in engaging the public on this issue. We would like to see, like I said, every Nebraskan who cares about this there at the hearings, because that's when you'll have a voice. That's when they will have their say. But until then, just want to thank our friends in the media here as I conclude for showing up, for being here, and for covering this extremely vital part of the legislature's business. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gavin. And we will round out our speakers with Creighton Hofer, also with Common Cause Nebraska.
Thank you, Becky. I am Creighton Hofer. I am the field organizer with Common Cause Nebraska. I use he, him pronouns. I would just like to, I'll keep this brief because all of our other panelists and members have done a great job of expressing kind of the point of this whole process. But I do want to just touch on the sort of the role that I've had within Common Cause in partnering with some of our other voting rights and democracy advocate partners in the nonprofit world, as well as outside of that. Essentially what I've been doing in organizing around this is trying to engage the public by stripping aside the sort of normal approach to how you people talk about or go about redistricting, by speaking to communities and identifying them around more immediate values and also to immediate geography. And this has been kind of a very helpful process, I think, for a lot of people that may not exactly understand redistricting or come at it with a bias towards partisanship, or even a perceived bias that that the process itself is inherently partisan. And it can really help to strip away that notion and actually reframe what can be important to people and how it can be. And I guess the unfortunate part that I find in all this is, after doing some of this work, that input is not going to be able to be shared, or at least is only available in such a short window and related to the maps that are being proposed. There was not an effort by the committee to try to engage the public on this and take that kind of input, and there was adequate time even prior to the census results, for that to happen. So as someone that's been working on this, as well as, all of our other partners, I guess I would just express a frustration that the committee has decided to go about this the way that they have, seemingly for their own interests. But with that, I thank everybody for being on this call, and pass it back to Becky. Thank you.
Thank you, Creighton. And thank you to all of our panelists for speaking on this important topic. I now want to open it up for questions. I know that we already have a couple in our queue, but welcome to everyone else to ask any questions you may have. So feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. You can drop them in the chat as well, or if you would like to ask your question verbally, feel free to use that raise your hand button, and I will unmute you. We just ask that you identify yourself and the outlet that you're affiliated with. So with that, we have a couple in the lineup here. To start, Carol mentioned this being a speedy process this time around because of census numbers, but how long does the process usually take? Carol and Danielle, do y'all want to kick us off with this one? Carol, why don't you start?
Okay. Generally, that census data gets to the states in April. We are roughly 4 months behind in getting the data. Our first data really came in about August 12th. And maybe someone can even clear this up for me. We understood that the Legislative Research Office was the first to draw the initial maps, but seemingly from what was said was that, and there was some conflict between senators on this, but that the senators would be bringing their first maps. So, we were a little concerned, obviously, even about that initial step in getting the data, who draws the initial maps based on the actual numbers. So, yes, and of course that has squeezed this up so that all of the deadline, all of this has to get done so that the filing deadlines can be met locally for district races. So I just see this all just rolling like a ball down the hill. It's just like we just don't seem to have a minute to get in there, nor to find out, like even these initial maps are not in a format that we can look at them and clearly see where are the streets, where are the landmarks, what are the surrounding borders. It's just, to me, crazy the way they have not openly disclosed this information.
And may I add,
Oh, sorry.
that, with your permission, Becky, I would add that the process, as complex as redistricting, we have stated the need for transparency and for access and all of that. The public, well, the groups that are represented here spend a lot of our own time, and our volunteers and groups focusing, but the public needs as much time as possible for them to have the knowledge of these things going on, and to be able to get deeper and understand, to be educated on the process, and to let their respective senators know their thoughts. And so when you speed up the process, you speed the process up, but you reduce the public's awareness and input, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, thank you, Preston. Go ahead, Danielle.
Oh, thanks so much, Becky and Carol and Preston, of course. But I just wanted to add a few more ideas there. So I think it's well established, and we all understand that due to the global pandemic and due to attempts by the Trump administration to frustrate the census process, both of those key driving factors resulted in delays. So every state is in the same boat, so to speak, when it comes to kind of where we are in terms of timeline with receiving and processing the once in a decade census information that's now before us. And I think that's a really important point here as well. Not every state is kind of rushing through with this process. A lot of our sister states are taking a little bit more time, taking a little bit more deliberative approach. Now, some have moved more quickly than Nebraska, but a lot are taking a lot more time. To make sure that they get this right, to make sure that there's more transparency, to make sure that there's more participation from voters and citizens, to understand the process and the draft maps and engage. And so, you know, just one point here of by way of example, in a typical legislative session, you'd have at least 7 days from bill introduction before public hearing, and many times much, much longer, to prepare your testimony, to get the word out, to organize, to analyze. And now we, of course, have a truncated rule available when the Nebraska legislature is in special session. But that being said, I think it is a clear missed opportunity and a failure of leadership for Speaker Hilgers and others to really rush this process through. And they should be utilizing, and still can utilize, the powers that they have available to build in recess days, to build in a more workable time frame, so that not only can the senators have an opportunity to learn more, find consensus, but more Nebraskans can weigh in on the process, which is critical in our unicameral system. And it's very clear that the speaker reserves the right to change the legislative calendar at any time. So we will continue to be in dialogue with him about utilizing his powers to set the calendar in a fair way. The other thing that I want to just go back and reaffirm and reiterate is, Carol, you're right. We're hearing a lot about candidate deadlines and some other kind of deadlines that are out there that are causing additional pressures on legislators to move quickly. But what we have to remember is this: redistricting is not about candidates, and it's not about incumbents. It's about voters. That's what we have to center. That's what we have to focus on. That's what we have to get right. So at first blush, some of those arguments might seem kind of interesting, like, oh gosh, we have to get this done because of residency requirements. Oh gosh, we have to get this done because of filing requirements. But really, we shouldn't and we can't rush this process, because we've got to get it right for voters. This is about people. This shouldn't be about politicians. And we can't be confused or distracted by those kinds of arguments. I know that we have some other questions in the queue, particularly about CD2 and otherwise, but just a little bit on process and timeline there that I wanted to add as well.
Oh, that's very helpful, Danielle, Preston, and Carol. So thank you very much for that. And speaking of the question you just brought up, we're gonna jump to that one. Nicholas asks, can speakers address the two plans that came out of the redistricting panel, especially the GOP one that splits CD2 and the city of Omaha? Preston, do you want to take the first jump at this, and then others, if you would like to weigh in, go for it.
Well, I surely do, and I want you all to stop me after I get to be about 45 minutes. But let me just say, I mentioned in my comments that one of the things we surely advocate for in the redistricting process is the integrity of the communities and the long-term establishment of these communities, their culture, their neighborhoods, and their issue base. In Omaha, we have two communities that are identified that way for sure. In North Omaha, African Americans and Latinx in South Omaha. And so these communities are long-term stability, long-term continuity. And the last thing that you should want to do in any process is to split that in two and make that start all over as it relates to voting. I would use the example in North Omaha. One of the things that has affected my community economically, socially, in so many other ways was when we built a freeway right in the middle of the community. We divided the community in half and we disrupted it, and affected it, and we're still suffering from it. This is a voter freeway, if you will say. That approach is not the right approach. And by the way, if you want to gerrymander, there's two basic ways you could do that. One is to split the vote, and the other is to water it down. There are proposals on one of the sides, one of the parties, that it tries to do both of those.
Thank you, Preston. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Danielle, go ahead.
I'll jump in there just a little bit because a couple of points. One, I think the congressional district proposals have been put out very, very recently in advance of fast approaching public hearings are generating the most headlines and the most buzz on social media. And, you know, congressional districts always generate a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, particularly with the Congress itself being so closely split, and midterms elections right around the corner, not to mention the next presidential, and Nebraska's unique electoral vote split, which always generates a lot of voter interest and excitement and engagement as well. So that's all at play with those CDs. I definitely want to weigh in on that. But I do want to make sure to reaffirm how critical the legislative districts are as well, which so far have been kind of flying under the radar screen and will most likely have just as much of an impact on everyday Nebraskans' lives as those congressional district boundaries. So from the ACLU perspective, and I know my nonprofit colleagues on the call here today, you know, we approach this from strictly nonpartisan perspective. So we're not concerned or interested in a blue dot or a red dot, or a blue dot or a red sweep or whatever it might be, but are really looking at what the law tells us about redistricting and what's important and what's fair. So when you look at, for example, the Linehan proposals and how they divide congressional districts, and particularly congressional district 1 and 2, you know, some red flags pop up. That's absolutely for sure under both federal and state law. The Nebraska Constitution is clear that we need to follow county lines whenever practical. Best practices in redistricting, including in the legislative resolution, say we got to honor existing cores of district. We've got to honor communities of interest within the districts. We have to be as compact as possible. So when you see these proposals that divide communities of interest, that divide counties, that are not compact, that expand over now 3 counties instead of 2, that's going to raise a lot of red flags, along with exactly where Preston started us off at. What does this mean for voters of color and Black voters in particular? And federal law is crystal clear on this point of view. You cannot dilute that power and strength. And it happens 2 ways. One, through packing, putting minority voters together, kind of smushing them together into districts, or by breaking them apart, cracking. And I think that those concerns about cracking are really popping in to the congressional district proposals before us. And it's something that has caused a lot of red flags and a lot of concerns for folks on this call and beyond. So we definitely see grave concerns with the proposals that Senator Linehan has put forward in terms of whether or not they would actually comply with statutory or constitutional law and redistricting principles and the guidelines the legislature set for itself, contained in the legislative resolution on redistricting. There are, I think, maybe lesser concerns about the alternatives that Senator Wayne and others have put forward there. But again, we're working as hard and as fast as everybody else to analyze, and the data and the formats are not incredibly precise, which makes that analysis even more challenging in a compressed time frame. But you know, the CDs pop out quickly as red flags that we're concerned about from a legal perspective.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Preston, for that answer. We've got a few more questions in the Q&A box, but I see that Joe has his hand up. Joe, go ahead and ask your question. Should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. My first question is under the category of elections have consequences. given the fact that you've got 33 Republican state senators and 17 Democratic state senators, isn't it politically naive to think that they're not going to flex those partisan muscles and not listen to those who say be nonpartisan?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. And I think that, you know, I will absolutely reject that premise, Joe. And let me tell you why. It's because it's embedded in our unique political culture as Nebraskans. Nebraskans have been so proud of not only our unique unicameral legislature, but the fact that it's nonpartisan. And as you well know, there definitely has not been redistricting without a great deal of attention and activity, but Nebraska, because of those nonpartisan features and otherwise, has been spared the worst abuses, maybe with an asterisk for 2011, than we've seen in some of our sister states. So I absolutely disagree with the premise of that question, and so do Nebraska voters, and that's clear in our polling. Nebraska voters do not want this to devolve into a partisan food fight. They want this to be data-driven. They want this to honor the best practices of redistricting. And the only way that we can make sure that happens is to push back against state senators and powerful partisan interests that utilize and seek that cynical approach. That's why we warmly invite more of our Nebraska neighbors to put aside that partisanship and focus on what's right for their family and their community. Focus on protecting their vote and their political power. And we in the second house absolutely have an opportunity to do that in Nebraska. And it just doesn't have to be that way here. And it shouldn't be that way because we have unique political traditions that honor nonpartisanship.
And I would add, very well stated, but I would add that the gray area of partisanship does hover over those numbers that you mentioned, Joe. But when you walk too far in the gray area, you walk into illegality. Gerrymandering is illegal. And so we have to not allow the fact that there is not a perfect divide of Republicans and Democrats, but there has to be a perfect speak to the legality of the actions of the process. And so we cannot allow that to happen just because.
Thank you. Go, Gavin.
Yeah, no, I can jump in here real quick. What I would add to that, Joe, is that it does not have to be a partisan process. Whether our legislators make it a partisan process is on them, but there are plenty of states that don't even have this process in the hands of legislators themselves. They're independent redistricting committees made up of non-elected officials. So states are doing this in a way to minimize partisanship. They are doing it in a way that cuts that out of the process. And as Daniel pointed to, people don't want it that way. The average Nebraskan doesn't want a partisan broken process. Is it naive of us to think otherwise? I don't know, that feels unfair. We're here to stand up for what should be, what is the correct way and the most representative way to go about this process. And I think we could all stand by the principle that it should be voter focused and it should be done in a way that involves every Nebraskan. Whether our legislature decides to make it partisan or keep it partisan is almost of no concern to me personally. Our goal is to continually raise the issue and to make sure that people are educated and participate. But this does not have to be partisan. That is not a logical or necessary conclusion of any of this. It's possible to keep it out of that fray if we make it that way, and if we follow the law to make it that way.
Can I have one quick follow-up question?
Absolutely.
Given Preston Love's comments about the illegalities of gerrymandering, if there is a feeling when this is all said and done that the process was illegal, is there time to go to court, and will you go to court?
I'm happy to jump in there and
Go for it.
Other folks have thoughts to add as well, but I think thanks for your question, Joe. Number one, the first consideration is stopping bad ideas and bad maps at the legislative stage, right? Like, let's not put the cart before the horse here. These maps, these proposals are not a foregone conclusion. They're subject to public input at public hearings this week. And then there will be 3 rounds of debate, which typically will generate at least some amendment or some change in order to what sounds like will be needed to break a filibuster on either side of things. So I do anticipate that there will be changes in the process from the draft maps that we have introduced today and put forward today. And the clearest and best way to resolve our differences is through the legislative process first and foremost, so that we get it right, so that there is clarity for all stakeholders, so that none of the stakeholders, including the state of Nebraska, have to be subject to costly, lengthy civil rights litigation that may ensue if they get it wrong from a process or a result perspective. And that specter hangs there regardless, right? I think that legislators are very clear-eyed in understanding that if they don't follow the law, if they don't follow their own processes, that does provoke risks of litigation from a host of different stakeholders involved in these issues. And when it comes to timing, again, I think that that's really a question about putting the cart before the horse, but federal courts have some special processes put together to look at redistricting cases. The state Supreme Court has been active in Nebraska in the past when those state law questions have come up. So there is a clear body of case law to move forward if the legislature gets it wrong from a legal perspective. And I can tell you that we at the ACLU and our partners will absolutely be looking for any violations of federal law when it comes to a racial gerrymander. We will absolutely be looking hard at cases that don't get it right on basic apportionment, that don't follow one person, one vote. And then, we'll have to look and see what else might be at play in terms of failures of process or suspect results with where the legislature ends up over the next couple of critical weeks. So we're never going to take a key strategy like litigation off the table, but it's just premature to start down that path. The first best option is for Nebraskans to speak out, to engage, and to tell their legislators to keep working until they get it right. They get it right when it's data driven, it's nonpartisan, and it's fair, period.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, and thanks for those questions, Joe. Jessica has some questions here that I think we've kind of answered, but just want to quickly touch on them. Based on what we're seeing with maps being proposed, do you believe that we can truly find a truly fair map in such a short time? And if we do you think it will be accepted by the governor at the end of the process? Gavin, do you want to take that one? Maybe.
Well, there's a lot there. That's what I'm sitting here thinking, going, there's a lot loaded in that. Anybody else, I'll think about it. But if anybody else has a thought first, I'll let you go.
I kind of wonder about this too, because, in the earlier session, the governor had to withstand overturns. I don't think he's going to want to go through that, is my opinion. And I'm hoping that we don't. I'm hoping that he, in the interest of process and moving along, that he will approve what happens. Just my opinion.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of ideas there, maybe why Gavin gathers his thoughts. One, I do think it will be, to your first question, from a timeline perspective, Jessica, I do think it will be very challenging for them to put forth a comprehensive and thoughtful proposal in such a short period of time before the Nebraska legislature. That being said, our legislature is special and hardworking, and if anyone can do it, it's the Nebraska legislature and we the people that are holding them accountable throughout that process. But I do think that the time constraints do add an extra layer of challenge. And I would reiterate that it is incumbent upon Speaker Hilgers and others to adjust that legislative calendar to get things right and to center the voters and to ensure that this is not rushed and that this is deliberate. Number two, when it comes to Governor Ricketts, it might be a surprise to you, but he doesn't usually forecast his legislative strategy to me or others. He's usually a little bit closer to the vest and to some of his key stakeholders about that. But I think, it depends and it remains to be seen. I do commend Speaker Hilgers for setting forth a legislative calendar that doesn't give the governor an opportunity to do a pocket veto, and then the legislature doesn't have a chance to come back in and fight for their maps. So as it is currently constructed, the legislature will have an opportunity to have the last word, which I think is appropriate. And it just remains to be seen exactly how engaged the governor is in this process and whether or not these proposals align with his policy preferences and political preferences. Senator Linehan, who's chair of the committee, has been very transparent in the media that she is keeping the governor closely informed of her work. So while that's not necessarily unusual for a state senator to work closely with the governor, I do think it provokes some questions, and questions for Senator Linehan. How closely is she coordinating with the governor's office? What kind of information are they sharing? What are the bottom line policy preferences that he has expressed to her in what kind of maps he will send forward? And it is really important, because of this lack of transparency thus far in this compressed timetable, that Senator Linehan and others are honest about that, so that Nebraska voters can make an informed decision about what is driving this map. Is it data or is it powerful partisan interests?
I would add also that, again, this is not a mutual admiration society, but I surely agree with you, Danielle, in your analysis. But I want to say this, that the governor has expressed several times his now opposition to, or his desire to return to winner take all in the congressional. And there is, quite frankly, an opportunity to backhand that through the redistricting process. You can, in effect, make the district make up being one that couldn't be won in any other way. So you could get winner take all without ever having to say it. And so that concerns me, that his desire, because he's expressed it publicly, will get in the way of a fair look at the way Congressional District 2 ends up.
We've got, go ahead, Gavin.
I was just, all I would add after hearing a lot of my own thoughts, thank you guys, is that yes, it is going to be an uphill battle. It is going to be a political fight inside the legislature to come to fair maps, but it is doable. And if the legislature, if as a body they can come together and agree on a set of maps, I find it hard to think that the governor is going to win that fight at the end of the day. If they can sit down as senators, create a set of maps, even if he vetoes, the political work that will go into that set of fair maps, the agreements, the bargains made that create those districts are in the legislature. And at the end of the day, it's their decision whether or not those are the maps that end up being the case. And so even a veto from the governor's office, I don't think stops a truly fair set of maps that the legislature itself has put together. Even with his influence on members of the legislature, even with his political strength, fair maps that come out of the body, I think would have a very, very good chance of withstanding a veto and of being upheld by the legislature itself, if nothing else than to justify their work and to justify the effort it took to reach that agreement. Uphill battle, but one that can be done by the body and doesn't have to be overruled by the governor if they're working in unity.
Awesome, thank you. We do have another question about CD2 and Senator Linehan. Geithner asks, what are some of the guidelines under federal election law prohibiting the dilution of minority voters in redistricting, And how do those requirements relate specifically to North Omaha under the 2nd district map from Senator Linehan? I don't know who wants to take that one. Go ahead, Preston.
Well, I don't know that I could cite the law, but I do know that the generic answer is that gerrymandering is illegal. But the point is this, there is a track record from the 2008 election where the Democratic presidential nominee won the 2nd congressional district. And then in 2020, the Democratic nominee won the 2nd congressional district. In both cases, there was an immediate reaction by the other party to do away with the non-winner take all approach. Expressed, as I mentioned before, one of the people who expressed it immediately after the 2020 was the governor. But the idea is that I mentioned there's a couple of different ways in which you can do harm there. One is to, you can divide it as one of the maps suggests, but the other thing you can do, it was mentioned, but maybe not focused, is you can dilute the community vote by surrounding it with unrelated voters that will in effect reduce the impact of the vote, like in North Omaha. And the fact that you add counties here and there surely is a dilution technique to in effect gerrymander. And so if it can be proven that that is the case, that is illegal, I can't cite the law. And it is a very dear and serious concern because it can be almost tracked that it is being done as a reaction to the effect of a previous election that favors one party. So, but the party that gets favored in the past is because the people voted, not because someone drew a line.
Thank you, Preston. And thank you everyone for sticking around. We got a couple more questions and then we will wrap. We appreciate your patience and thanks to all of our speakers for answering all these good questions. Danielle.
Yeah, thanks. And I put a note in the chat there as well. But so to follow up on Preston's key point, racial gerrymandering is absolutely illegal and unconstitutional. And the courts have been absolutely clear about that. And so I think what those cases mainly emanate from is under the Voting Rights Act and then also under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And it's really important that Nebraska legislators think carefully about these points because just in the past couple of weeks, the federal Department of Justice has put state legislators on notice to engage in gerrymandering at your own risk, to engage in racial discrimination at your own risk, and have really prioritized and heightened monitoring and enforcement around suspect redistricting plans and proposals that would violate prohibitions against racial gerrymandering. So you see this pop up and the courts look at a bunch of different factors when deciding whether or not there was an impermissible or unconstitutional racial gerrymander. Sometimes it's very overt, right? And that's probably the exception to the rule where legislators are making statements about their intent to engage in racial gerrymandering or discrimination. But really what we see more so, particularly in the modern era, is when there's really a culmination of factors that have that end result that is discriminatory from a racial perspective. So the court will look really carefully at the different factors under federal law and under Supreme Court precedent about whether or not this is an impermissible racial gerrymander. So that's really important to remember. And that's usually when people think about gerrymandering and when it should raise the most red flags. Additionally, I think it's important to tease out here that the state legislatures need to be careful about partisan redistricting as well. There's a lot of confusion out there that just because the Supreme Court failed to act in setting a clear standard on partisan redistricting in some recent cases, other state courts have taken up the issue of partisan gerrymandering and found, for example, under provisions very similar to Nebraska's constitution, which guarantees free and fair elections, that if there is an egregious partisan gerrymander, that can violate constitutional provisions of state constitutions. And of course, those partisan prohibitions are also in the legislative resolution binding the senators on redistricting. So legislators, gerrymander at your own risk. From a racial or a partisan perspective, I think that that is definitely an area that could provoke costly, lengthy civil rights litigation. And I think just in general, those are all kind of key areas that we're going to be watching for, and to see whether or not, for example, legislators might be using partisanship really as a veil for racial gerrymandering, really as a pretext for racial gerrymandering, because there can be such strong correlations sometimes between partisanship and race. So that's what legislators should definitely be learning more about, should be thoughtful about, should be receiving counsel about. And they'll need to, really be able to back up and show their work. Were they utilizing factors that were permissible, that were appropriate? Or were they using factors, data, information, consulting with partisan interest to advance a racial or a partisan gerrymander? All of that will come to light if there would be litigation down the road.
Thanks, Danielle, and thank you, Preston, as well. Andrew is asking for just a quick couple reactions to a bill that was introduced that would increase senators to 50. Who wants a couple quick reactions? Gavin, I'm going to put you on the spot again. I saw you on mute. There you go.
For sure. So quick reaction to that one, and it actually could tie into this other question we have. There is an interesting, from Common Cause perspective, 49, 50 legislators. The old doesn't matter the count. It's really, can we fairly represent the people of Nebraska with the count of legislators we have? I think there's certainly a discussion to be had at the state level in terms of how many legislators do we need to fairly represent both the people of Nebraska and the geographic boundaries of Nebraska. We are dealing as a state with a question of population shifting, right, from our west half to our east half. And there are questions of spreading out districts, losing the local character of our districts, of not having enough senators to represent. In the end, as I said, 49, 50, it doesn't make a difference in terms of, from our perspective, the legality of redistricting or necessarily the accuracy. But I think it would be fair to ask, and it's fair from those who are bringing it up, to say, do we need more legislators to accurately and fairly represent every Nebraskan? If our goal is to have one person, one vote, and have every voice heard, have everyone engaged, there's no reason we couldn't increase to meet that goal, but there's no reason we have to increase at the same time to meet that goal. I don't know, I'd be interested in hearing from everyone else.
Yeah, a couple of things on that point. I think that Senator Coulterman's proposal is being reviewed very skeptically after its introduction today, as it should be. And it can't be taken in a vacuum, right? As Gavin said, I don't think that there's any significant legal issues as to whether or not the Nebraska legislature has 49 or 50 members, but you have to look at the timing for the introduction. And if this is an effort meant to dilute the impact of the most recent census results and to try and stymie or mitigate the impacts of that changing, shifting demographic from west to east, I think that's what really raises red flags and concerns for groups on this call and beyond. Again, the data is clear. There should be a shift in legislative seats, for example, in Nebraska, at least one, if not two or more, moving from west to east. So by expanding the number of legislatures, it can, at this time, it could be seen as really a cynical attempt to try and mitigate or stymie what the census data results tell us. And that can really subvert the point of one person, one vote. So I think that we need to watch that very carefully. I think we also need to look at and remember, for example, that proposals similar to Senator Coulterman's were introduced in years past and were not advanced to the full legislature for a host of different policy and political reasons. So while it may be permissible under our Constitution to add another senator, I do think that we need to look very carefully about what the intent behind that is. And if it's to blunt the impact of the census, I think that's very, very troubling. And note, as a person who originally hails from rural Nebraska, greater Nebraska, make no mistake that the changing demographics are painful for communities, and I absolutely want to give voice to that. But we have to be liberated by the data, and we have to follow what the law tells us. The farther away we get from one person, one vote, the less fair that is in a democracy. When we give certain districts and certain votes more power than others, that's problematic. And so we, no matter how painful that shift might be, even in a state like Nebraska, we have to honor our democratic values and what the law tells us. And that's to get as close to one person as one vote as possible.
Thank you. And our last question of today's media brief, thanks to everyone for hanging in there. Jessica asks, much of the attention has been focused on Douglas and Sarpy County since the maps were proposed. How do you bring voters in West Nebraska into this process and make them feel like they are being heard about their concerns as well? So Carol, I'm going to kick it to you to start, and then maybe y'all can finish with actions as well that folks can take to get involved in these hearings and the redistricting process as we sort of close out our brief here.
Well, the league particularly has been doing quite a bit of redistricting education around the state. Yesterday we went to Lincoln. On Thursday we'll go to North Platte, and it will give us an opportunity to talk to those folks in rural Nebraska and say, you do have an opportunity to get in there and, email your legislators, give them a call, go to the hearing. Well, the hearing will be over for them already at that time, which we didn't know, of course, when we were scheduling another issue that I'm frustrated with. But, there are ways still to get involved and to hear you, get your voice heard. So we're putting that message out as much as we can, and we'll do that. But I think it's a lot of on the legislature to say, hey, we want to hear from you, and to do more to make that happen.
Preston.
Are you looking for my closing?
Yeah, closing and what can people do with your org to get involved and make their voice heard in this redistricting process as you kick off this sort of very fast race we've got going here in Nebraska.
Yes. Well, first of all, as I mentioned before, the more the people know, the better it is, because they can give input. They can not only be active and verbal and responsibly understanding the processes, and then they will become better voters. In an attempt to do that, I would take my little time here to say that we're having, Black Votes Matter is hosting a town hall meeting tomorrow, Tuesday at 6 p.m. at 2514 North 24th Street. I put my phone number on the chat for better information. There is a flyer that's available, but that meeting is intended for the public a coalition of many people who, groups that are on this call, who have been working on this to educate people and answer questions from them, friendly people as well as friendly press. The press surely is invited, but that is one of the things that we're trying to do, is educate the public to all of these things going on, in spite of the stress and the trauma that people are going through in their lives. They still have a need to understand and be involved in these matters.
Thank you. Gavin.
Yeah, I'll jump back over to that question about engaging Western Nebraska in this. I think the one big thing to point out there is, first of all, yes, in the congressional scheme, maybe people and voters in Western Nebraska may not feel as though they have a lot at stake here. But as Danielle said earlier, legislative districts are huge. They are vital. And the people of Western Nebraska are the only ones who can tell us whether or not the districts as they're drawn actually represent their communities. People in Western Nebraska have no less stake in the redistricting process than those in urban Nebraska and Lincoln and Omaha. They have the exact same stake in the process and the same amount to lose in the process by not getting involved. Yes, there are big questions about the congressional districts, but when it comes down to those local legislative districts, it matters where lines are drawn just as much. It matters what communities we put together to form a legislative district. It matters what counties we put together to form a legislative district. And the people of Western Nebraska are really the only ones who can say whether or not those maps are fairly drawn and fairly represent them. Yes, we can look at the data from a bird's eye view and best try to examine how demographics have shifted, where populations live, but it's really up to each individual to say, this is my community, and I don't want you to break it up. I don't want you to draw a line through my neighborhood. I don't want you to include town X instead of town Y, because we have shared interests, we have shared history. Those are the types of little details that the redistricting process so far, I think, is overlooked. They have overlooked the genuine community aspects of this. Voting is vital in terms of how we distribute power and how people have a say. And part of that is who you're voting with, who is in your district, and whether or not they're part of your community. And that's no different whether you live in rural Nebraska or urban Nebraska. Every single Nebraskan has a stake in their voting communities, in the way their maps are drawn. And that doesn't change depending on which side of the state you live on, what your income is, what color your skin is. None of that changes the fact that people all across the state have a stake and should make their voices heard, even if they feel like their congressional district is secured. The local maps, the legislative maps, they need the input of local people, not just the legislature. Thank
you, Gavin. And last but certainly not least, Danielle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, again, I want to reject kind of the premise that this has to be an urban-rural fight. I think that, we have to honor the process, which is grounded in census data, and the census data tells us where Nebraskans are living and working. And that should be driving our decisions about political representation and community resources. So whether you're from Scottsbluff, Schuyler, or South Omaha, one person, one vote. That fairness principle is what has to liberate us from these broken kind of non-winnable arguments about Democrats and Republicans or urban versus rural. We have to, that's why we have the data. That's why we have the law to help us work through these issues when our emotions are high or partisanship is high or those urban rural splits, are really, really painful. That's why we have to fall back on the law and the data to help us get it right and ensure basic fairness. And everybody benefits when there's basic fairness in the process and in the result. And Gavin is absolutely right. It's up to each of us to tell our story about our community and to help legislators understand that, these aren't just arbitrary lines to scribble on a map. These really impact access to healthcare, access to public resources, what kind of criminal justice and education policy we're going to have, what kind of tax policy we're going to have, whether or not we're going to have fair elections in this state for the next 10 years. So this is about more than just kind of that bureaucratic wrangling. This is the heart of our democracy, and it's go time, and we can do it together. I want to end on that aspirational, inspirational note, that it doesn't have to devolve into partisan shenanigans. It doesn't have to break down on urban and rural disagreements. Coming together, we can ask for a fair process and a fair result that honors the principle of one person, one vote, that honors our proud nonpartisan traditions in Nebraska. And we can continue our work together to make Nebraska a strong, free, and fair place now and for generations to come.
Amazing, thank you. Huge thank you to all of our amazing panelists today, Carol, Danielle, Gavin, Creighton, Preston. Great job explaining all of this, and thank you for staying a little over, and huge thanks to all of you who joined us today. Appreciate you taking even this extra time to be here with us and getting out the word about how important it is for Nebraskans all over the state to engage in this really, really crucial process. So thank you for being here. Have a great rest of your day, and we will talk to you later.